Welcome to Aircrew Interview. I'm Mike, your host, and this is part 2 of our interview with Paco Chierici. In this episode, he chats about the documentary he produced and created called Speeding Angels, and also his new novel, Lines of the Sky. I also want to thank our sponsor, Laco Watches, who were one of the original companies to produce pilot watches for the Luftwaffe during World War II. They produce both A and B dial watches in different sizes to suit all tastes, which adopt the look of times gone by but still satisfied modern demands. You can check out all their models and products via www.laco.d. Thank you. A couple of things, because you mentioned some operation conflicts, but how many were you actually involved with, and would you say the A-6 was capable at this point in time?
Yeah, so I flew in Southern Watch, which was it was the sort of police action that was taken after the conclusion of the first Gulf War. There were a lot of restrictions placed on Saddam Hussein, and then everybody basically left, and he began violating them almost immediately. So we, when I left on my first deployment, we were emergency recalled to the ship from port call in Busan, Korea, and then steamed right through a Category 5 typhoon on the Ranger, trying to get on station. And so I flew in Southern Watch, and then I flew in Restore Hope, which was the operation to protect the United Nations relief forces in Somalia. And we were the first ship on station for both Restore Watch and I think Restore Hope, maybe. But yeah, at the time, it was the A-6 was this was in 93, and the A-6 eventually went away. I think in 96 was the last flying squadron that was decommissioned. So it was a pretty quick decommissioning process. Once they were sort of thinking about, when I was flying the airplane, everybody thought the A-12 was going to come out, which would have been the super stealthy follow-on to the A-6. And then there was some that program was cut out. Then there was some talk about the A-6F, which would have been, a much more digital version of the Intruder with bigger engines, but it still was the same airplane. So it was still this, this very unsurvivable, unstealthy airplane. And I think unfortunately wisely, that plane was also axed from the planning process. So we didn't know, like when I was on my first deployment flying the A-6, we didn't really know that the entire community was basically 3 years away from going away. We had no idea. We still felt very much in the mix. The A-12 was going away, but we knew, or we believed, that something else was going to take its place. So we still felt very relevant, and actually very capable in terms of flying in Southern Watch and in flying for Restore Hope. And our primary mission, Restore Hope, was to we strapped 500-pound bombs, laser-guided bombs on the airplanes, and the threat was these cars that are called technicals. They're just like a Toyota pickup truck with a 50 caliber machine gun strapped to it. They're very common in the Middle East and in Africa. And these warlords, the government in Somalia had failed, and so these warlords are taking over and they're stealing everybody's food. So we'd be flying over country and we'd see farm fields filled with water and crops, but nobody was tending to them, because why would you? As soon as you harvested the crops, the warlord would pull up and kill you and take your food, or at least take your food. So the UN was coming in with C-130s and trying to deliver food to the populace, and the warlords were taking that food as well. So our job was to provide air cover, which I thought we were very well suited to. But again, that the mission of the airplane, it basically went away. It went, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but it was heavy, or medium weight bomb, lots of bombs on target, to precision strike. And then all of a sudden in the early 90s, these GPS bombs started coming out, and you didn't need a laser anymore to designate targets. You could type in a coordinate and you could put a bomb through somebody's window. So the plane basically just, its capabilities were not able to evolve with the times.
Yeah, it had its day, I think. By that.
Yeah, and it's a good run. It was 40 years or so. That's not bad. That's
Exactly.
not bad at all. It's no B-52, but
that thing is going to go on forever.
I agree.
But yeah, so before we wrap up the A-6 portion of the interview, do you have maybe a memorable story to share with us, and how long did you actually spend on the A-6?
I spent, including the RAG, 3.5 years. So 2.5 years in my fleet squadron. I think my Kuwaiti story was probably the most memorable single flight. The other most memorable thing that happened to me was before my night landings, my very first night landing ever. You may have heard the story already, but it's still one of my favorites. It's we talked about it a little bit earlier, but the first night landing that a pilot does happens in his fleet squadron, or a fleet airplane that he's going to fly. So we come to this with zero experience. It's terrifying. There's nothing fun or gratifying about landing a fighter on an aircraft carrier at night. But it's still, you're 22, 23 years old. You're still bulletproof. And so my very first one, I was on the carrier waiting for my plane. And the plan was for my plane, which was currently with another student flying around doing his 6 landings. When he finished his last landing, they would chain it to the flight deck, keep the engines running. The pilot would climb out, I'd climb in, then the navigator would climb out, and then my navigator would climb in, and they'd pump us full of gas again, and off we'd go. And again, the engines would be running the whole time. And it's called a hot switch. So I went up to flight deck control, and I'll never forget, I'm sitting in flight deck control, and I'm watching the camera that shows the plane coming into land and the last stages. And I'm leaning over and I'm tightening up my chest strap. And as the plane touches down, I can see it rolling out in the landing area through the window in flight deck control. And as I'm sort of straightening up and getting ready to go, all of a sudden, the two crew members eject, and the plane angles towards the bow a little bit, and it screeches along the deck, and it crashes into 3 Hornets, and then it flips overboard. And it takes one of the Hornets, broke through all its chains, spun all the way around, and then flipped over with it. And one of the other ones flipped around, but it didn't go over. And I'm standing there with my hand on my chest strap, looking out the window, like my jaw must have been on the ground, thinking, oh, holy shit, my plane just went into the water of the Pacific Ocean. So, yeah, that was I didn't fly that night, obviously. But we did. We flew the next day, right back at it. Yeah, it is. I think, other than the Kuwaiti flight, it is the most traumatic and memorable event that happened to me. Almost in naval aviation, because that was my jet. I was supposed to jump in that jet, and if that hook, and what had happened was the hook failed. The metal just snapped, and there was nothing that the aircrew could have done. They couldn't have kept flying. They were too slow to fly and too fast to stop on the flight deck. So they wisely ejected out of the airplane, and bam, almost $300 million worth of assets just went right into the ocean.
Well, certainly luck was on your side that day then. That's for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
But so it sounds like you had an absolutely wonderful time on the A-6. But just to move on, because I do want to chat a bit about your F-14 time. But how did you eventually get your dream jet?
Yeah, so I was in the first squadron to get decommissioned, and we knew we were getting decommissioned when we returned from this deployment. So it wasn't a big surprise. I had already been the Ranger. Air Wing 2 that I was in was a very unique and one of the last of the old air wings. We had no F-18s on board. It was an older, oil burning ship. We had 2 A-6 squadrons and 2 F-14 squadrons. And I knew that when I finished with VA-155, which was my first fleet squadron, I was just going to roll right over into VA-145. And it was going to be an almost seamless transition. So that was, I think, in March or April of 93. And I rolled right into 145 as planned. And almost the day I got there, we got word that at the end of the fiscal year, which was in September, just a few months away, VA 145 was also going to get decommissioned. Now, that was a surprise. So, as soon as I got to VA 155, we knew our clock was ticking, and that's fine. We were going to deal with it. But, we got to 145 and thinking I had this whole career ahead of me flying A6s, the squadron's getting decommissioned. And not only that, they're really accelerating the decommissioning process of all A6 squadrons. And so everybody was now trying to scramble and find a place to go. And it's kind of, in retrospect, amazing to me that, some master planner in the Pentagon didn't have a spot for all of us, but we were basically left to our own resources to find a new home. For me, it was now a second opportunity to go fly the F-14. It's very rare in the Navy to, or at least at the time, to change communities. If you're an A6 guy, you're generally an A6 guy for life. So all of a sudden, there's some guys going to fly Hornets. There's some guys that loved Whidbey Island, so they wanted to go fly the Prowler, the E-A6B, and a variety of different things. So the world was now wide open again. And I put in this big package, probably 100-page package of everything I'd done, and I got endorsements from my the commander of the air group, and the F-14 squadron COs, and I put this big package, submitted it to the transition board, and I was approved. And it was a huge day. It was really it felt like a massive victory for me.
Absolutely, yeah. So what was it like to fly, especially coming from the A6? You now have reheat at your exposal or afterburner. What was this like?
Yeah. It was the RAG is about a year long, and it was like a year-long Christmas. I felt like every day I went to work, it was like Christmas. And again, not that I didn't love the A6 or learn to love the A6, but this was the plane I'd really always imagined and dreamt of flying, and the community that I really enjoyed and wanted to be a part of. And the plane was just so much fun. It was just incredible to have all that thrust. And I flew the A, which was, in the fighter world, the A is not necessarily regarded as such an incredible fighter because it doesn't have enough thrust. But for me, coming from the A6, every day was Christmas. It was wonderful.
Yeah, I would love to chat to you more about the F-14. Maybe we can get you on to do a separate podcast on that. But so how many hours did you get on the F-14, and did you enjoy your time on it?
Yeah, I got, let's see, so even though I only flew the A6 for 2.5 years, I got, about 700 hours in that. And then in the F-14, I got basically the same, like maybe plus or minus 100 hours in the F-14. And I flew it for 3 years total. And yes, I mean, I enjoyed it. I was fortunate in my Navy career in that I was always busy. I was always flying. I know that in recent times there have been some lulls in the operational deployments, or people when they come back from deployments they don't get to fly. I was always flying. I flew my butt off. So I was I was in a fleet squadron for 2 years after I got to the F-14, and I was away from home for 18 months out of those 2 years. So we were flying a lot.
The reason I know about yourself is because I watched your brilliant documentary a few years ago now called Speeding Angels. So we have to talk about that. Where did the idea come from, and how were you involved in it?
Sure. I finished flying the F-14. I got off active duty. I got and there's a lot of long stories involved in that. It was a very painful and torturous decision, but I had decided to leave active duty Navy and go fly for the airlines, and I thought I was done. But it was naval aviation, and flying those jets was just such a deeply ingrained part of me, and I don't think I really fully realized that. A few months after I got off active duty, a friend of mine called me up and said, "Hey, I'm in the reserve unit flying F5s, and we are having a board. Are you interested in joining as a reservist? And man, I couldn't put my package in fast enough. I was like, absolutely. So I joined this squadron, and I learned to become an adversary pilot, which is a whole different story. But about halfway through that tour, and I was there for 10 years as a reservist, I could see the end coming. I've been flying in the Navy for 15 years now, between active and reserves, and I had maybe 5 or 6 more years. And I had begun doing a lot of writing. I was a Navy pilot for 20 years, I like to say, but I've been a writer my whole life. I've always been involved in storytelling, and I've been doing a lot of writing and trying to figure out the right way to tell the story of naval aviation. And at that time, really, there was Top Gun, which is such a boon and a curse to naval aviation. It's it's a wonderful thing and a horrible thing. And the only other really great Navy story that I had ever read was this thing called Flight of the Intruder, which Stephen Kuntz, great book, really. It was obviously about A-6s, and that was it. So I had written a few screenplays and trying to, figure out how to tell this story in a way that made me proud to tell it, and would make the people involved in it sort of proud that they were involved in it. And I saw a surfing documentary once, and it just completely opened my eyes to how I wanted to tell a naval aviation story. I wanted to be able to put people in the cockpit, not just to have one of those traditional, military channel documentaries like, the 5-inch rocket comes out at 700 miles an hour. I didn't want to do that. I wanted to make it a very much of an experiential story, where the viewer felt like they were part of what was happening. And with that kernel of an idea, I approached a good friend of mine who lived up in San Francisco. I live in the Bay Area here in California, and she is obviously a woman, a documentarian, and a California resident. So those 3 things are not necessarily favorable to the military. That's not her demographic. And I pitched her on the idea, and she was like, it's not my world. It's not my. I do stories about I do completely different stories that don't live in this world at all. And I convinced her to come out with me to my reserve unit in Fallon. And the original concept was to make a documentary about my squadron, about dogfighting and sort of the last vestiges of, this world of aerial combat that is barely hanging on, but we're the guys that are really good at it, and what we do is really cool, and people should know about it. And so she did, and she came out, and she fell in love with the community, with the people, with the planes. We managed to get some cameras up in airplanes and get some phenomenal footage. And we made a sizzle reel, which is like a 12-minute short film called Last of the Dogfighters. And you may have seen, I don't know if you've seen that, but that's really fun, actually.
No, I haven't. No.
Yeah, you should check it out on YouTube, Last of the Dogfighters. And it was my original concept for this documentary. And we managed to do it. I raised a bunch of money. I got permission from the Navy, official permission, although there's some long stories in that. But we started filming the documentary, and this director, her name is Peyton. We were in Key West, where we were going to be fighting against these young F-14 RAG students. And Peyton was riding in the van from the hotel to the airport with these young students. And she's just, she always had her camera with her, and she's just talking to them. And they are so excited and so exciting. And their life is so much more exciting to watch and to experience than the old aerial combat saints that are flying the F5s. They were so electric and so vibrant that she managed to convince me to pivot the film from The Last of the Dogfighters to Speed and Angels, to this story about the last 2 F-14 students and their lives, and and what happens to them as they go through the RAG as these young sort of puppies, and they come out of it fairly seasoned and more serious. So this is a 1 year of tremendous growth and danger. And then unbeknownst to us when we were filming, but they delivered so much more to us once they had finished their training. Each of them have such dramatic post-training stories that, we initially thought the documentary would take us 18 months, and it took 5 years, from conception to boom, we're done, and its distribution. So it turned into a far better story, and I'm glad that it did. And both those kids are, they're still very close friends of mine. But it as most things are, when they're live and you watch them evolve, we were just along for the ride for a lot of it, and it turned into something incredible.
Yeah, it's a brilliant documentary, and the aerial footage is absolutely incredible. But let's talk about that. How did you manage to coordinate this? I mean, it seemed as you say, 5 years, so it must have took some planning.
It was so the actual filming was maybe about 3 years. Mm-hmm. So there's two separate departments in the Navy that are involved with a production. There's the documentary division, where you can go talk to people and you get access to certain things. And then there's the sort of Hollywood side of it, where you actually take military assets that are used obviously for other things and then dedicate them solely for the production of, Top Gun or, JAG TV show or a documentary called Speed and Angels. I got permission from the Navy almost instantly to do the documentary portion, which meant that, I cut Peyton loose with her camera and she would run around and interview people. And we went all over. We went to, I think I mentioned Key West. We were in Fallon. We were on an aircraft carrier multiple times. So, we were all over the place talking to these kids as they were going through their experiences. And then on the flip side, getting back to the experiential, wanting the viewer to feel like they're in the cockpit. And that was what I had sold to my investors. We're going to get the most amazing aerial footage you've ever seen. I was banging my head against the wall for about 2 years, literally just no after no after no after no. And, repeatedly I would get a no. And then I'd say, well, do you mind if I talk to your, superior? Yeah. And it was awkward for me because I was not only a reservist, I was an active reservist. I was still flying and drilling. So I'm still a commander or lieutenant commander in the Navy. But I would call these people and I'd say, hey, this is who I am, but I'm calling you as a producer of a documentary. So, I know this is a weird thing, but just try to think of me as not a Navy person right now. Yeah. But I would obviously use my inside knowledge of the Navy to be able to navigate these corridors. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I eventually, through much begging and pleading, worked my way all the way up to the Chief of Naval Air Forces. And it took, say, another 6 months before I was actually able to mesh our schedules. And by mesh our schedules, I mean get 5 minutes on his schedule where I could come in and beg him for some time that we were going to have to pay for. It's not like he was going to give it to me for free. Mm-hmm. Although, I mean, it was free in the sense that he didn't get the money. When we wrote a check for all this, it went to the Department of Treasury. So the Navy was actually losing this time, mm-hmm. Which made it even more painful for them. And so I had this whole thing choreographed, pages upon pages of exactly how this is going to go. And we're going to have an airplane and we're going to have cameras on top of the mountains. And, it's going to take 5 days. We're going to need 4 F-14s and 4 F-5s. And I mean, it was like a incredible pitch, detailed briefing. And I had to give it to his chief of staff. And then he's like, all right, man, you come in tomorrow and give it to the admiral. That's your job. Don't fuck it up. And I walked in and I sort of gave the admiral, I let him see the sizzle reel, the 12-minute sizzle reel. And I told him what the concept was. And I showed him the briefing cards. And I gave him sort of just a general sense of what we were trying to do. And he looked at me and he was like, I like it. Let's do it. And that was it. It took me 2.5 years to get in front of this man. Oh my God. I felt like just going out. It was like 11 in the morning. I felt out and going out and having some drinks, and the time pressure was enormous because obviously we had been filming these F-14 students. And this was now the spring of 2006, and the F-14 was going away in 6 months. It was, I didn't have a whole lot of time to get permission to fly, the F-14 around, because it was gone. It was going to be gone. And I had been banging my head against this wall for 2.5 years. And finally it happened. And, 6 weeks later, the last F-14 deployment to Navy Fallon, we flew in this specially modified Learjet that had periscopes at the top and the bottom with HD cameras rigged to them for all the air-to-air scenes. And then we had these two HD cams with like 8-foot lenses. I mean, just incredibly massive lenses that you could practically film somebody on the moon with, that we put on top of a Fairview Peak of this mountain in Fallon. And we would film the ground-to-air sequences from that. So we basically did all the same maneuvers from the air and did air-to-air, and then did them on the ground as well, to get that different perspective. And then we wired up all the pilots with cameras inside the cockpits. We weren't able to put cameras on the outside of the cockpit because it would just, in terms of getting permission for that, it was just too onerous. But we got incredible footage on the inside of the cockpits. And then the way we depicted the dogfights, which seemed to be like a seamless thing, was we would take these audio clippings from the actual dogfight, and then we would film it interior, exterior, aerial, ground, to kind of clip it together into a logical looking dogfight. And I believe it came out pretty well.
Yeah, it's a stunning documentary, and it's a credit to you and the team how it came out, because I remember when I came across it for the first time, I was like, "What? Has anyone heard of this before?" And I was last to know, I think, but it's absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
But yeah, tell our viewers where we can actually find this online to watch.
Yeah, for sure. It's available if you have Amazon. I think it's available on Amazon Prime. I'm not sure about. I own the rights to Speed Angels, and I made it available to all territories. I believe that it's available in UK as well. But if that doesn't work on Amazon Prime, then iTunes for sure works globally, all territories.
So let's talk about something that's happened to you recently. You brought out a new book. It's called
Light in the
Sky. Tell us about this, because it's. I've read a couple of excerpts you sent me, and it's stunning already.
Thank you. So as I mentioned, I've been a writer my whole life, and much the same as I did with Speed and Angels, what I wanted to do with Lions of the Sky was write a thriller. It's a military thriller, a naval aviation military thriller. But I really, really wanted to bring the reader with me on this journey. And we start off similar to Speed and Angels in the training. And so you go on the journey with these young students as they go through all the same challenges that Jay and Megan did in Speed and Angels. But now you're feeling it. You really feel it. And as a reader, I think you can get even more in depth to the fears and the passions and the excitement and the drama and the danger of this world. And as they're going through that, and again, going through the same journey that Jay and Megan did, that you show up and you just feel like you're going to be flying a sports car, and your life is nothing but fun and speed. You go through these things that season you and make you realize that, once you hit the fleet, it's a real world out there. There's real bombs and real missiles and real adversaries that have their own training and are intent on pursuing their own goals and would be perfectly happy to shoot you down if you get in their way. And so as these kids are going through their training, there's this constant drumbeat of this global situation that's happening in the background, and it deals with the Chinese aggression in the South China Sea. And it's building in intensity as the kids are getting through their training, and obviously it comes to a peak and the crescendo as these two things meet at the end in the dramatic climax. And one of the things that always struck me about the way we go through training, and it's really inevitable, but you mentioned earlier, how long did it take you to begin training till you were combat ready? And that's technically the case. When you finish the RAG, you're technically combat ready, but you're so far from being proficient. You've done everything a couple times. but you're not necessarily good. You're
It's a different story, yeah.
oh yeah, you're not necessarily good. You're still sort of fumbling around to find the right switch, and in extremis, you don't really know how you're going to act. But as it happens so frequently, you can leave the squadron, and 10 days later, like Jay and Speed and Angels, you are in no shit combat where people are shooting at you and you're trying to execute your mission and fire weapons and not kill anybody that you're not supposed to kill. And it's real. And you go, from a training environment to an actual combat environment in a matter of days. So that's, I love that story and that intensity, and I brought that to the novel. And I use the real training and then the real world threat of the Chinese and the Spratly Islands and the South China Sea, and build this sort of crescendo at the end where the students come out and are thrown right into the mix.
So how much of the novel is based on fact or experiences you've had yourself?
Almost all of it. Yeah, almost all of it. I would say, everything in the novel is derived from either something that happened or something that happened to somebody else. Something happened to me or something that somebody else. And it's obviously fictionalized and enhanced to make it a little bit more thrilling. But everything down to the inciting incidents for the dramatic final climactic combat scene. I don't want to give it away too much, but a good friend of mine was an S3 pilot, and when he was off Taiwan many years ago, he thought he was in the process of an exercise trying to find a U.S. submarine, and so he and his crew were dropping sonobuoys and tracking this submarine and feeling very excited that they were finally able to track this U.S. submarine, which they weren't actually very good at doing. Well, it turns out they were tracking a Chinese submarine and doing such a good job that they scared the Chinese submarine captain, who radioed back to mainland China. The Chinese launched a number of fighters. The Navy saw the fighters launching and launched a number of their fighters, and all of a sudden you have this, cataclysmic cloud of fighters coming at each other, and nobody really knows that it all began with an accident. Obviously, in the real world, that incident was diffused by calmer heads, but in my book, I just used that story, and this story just always blew me away. But I used that story and I fictionalized it to bring the climactic battle sequence into being.
Yeah, it's very enticing, that's for sure. But how long did the book actually take you to write, and how different is it writing fiction to nonfiction?
Yeah, two great questions. The book took me probably 5 years to write.
Right.
That's a long time. But it's, for me anyway, it was very difficult and different writing nonfiction from fiction. Fiction from nonfiction. I'd written a ton of nonfiction, a bunch of articles, and I was editor for Fighter Suite for a long time. So it was my first foray into really long form fiction, but it was really that's what I want to do. That's my dream. I want to keep doing that. And I wanted to do it right. So, you can bang something out pretty easily, but I really wanted to do a good job and write a great story that was very compelling, that, again, I would be proud of. And it's difficult. So, you can, when you're writing nonfiction, you can, you take the facts and you write them, and they are what they are. And when you're writing fiction and you want people to be invested in your characters, and you want your characters to express themselves both internally and externally, what they're thinking and feeling, and then how they interact with the people around them, and you want to do it in a really genuine and compelling way. It's difficult to do that. It's difficult to do it well, certainly for me. So it took a while to refine that form for me. I think it's much smoother now. I've begun the sequel now, and it's going much more quickly.
Oh, brilliant. So what forms does the book come in? Is it hardback, softback, Kindle? Where can we find them?
Yep, Kindle, and I've got an exclusive with the book has an exclusive with Amazon right now in the Kindle edition, and there's paperbacks all over. And hardback, I think Barnes & Noble has it as well. So yes, it comes in all of the various formats, except right now, I think the audiobook is, they're shopping around for an audiobook deal.
So Paco, where can we find you online? Do you have a website or a book Facebook page to check this out?
I do. I have both a Facebook page. It's a Paco Chierici author page. And then I have a website, lionsofthesky.com. Obviously, Amazon has a presence as well.
And will you be doing signed copies?
I will be doing signed copies. It's an unanticipated demand. I didn't even imagine that people would want that, but I've had enough demand for that we're going to figure out a mechanism to get people signed copies. Brilliant. And that should be coming shortly. Yeah.
Brilliant. So do you have a copy handy so our viewers can see what their front cover looks like?
Yeah, there you go. Yep.
Awesome. What is on the front there? That looks like a flanker in the visor cover there.
It is. It's a flanker and an Alamo. So we're in the short hairs here. He's an idle. The fighter pilots at idle with chaff and flares coming out, hoping to survive this merge. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, Paco, just before we wrap up, there's a few questions, personal questions that I ask all our guests. So if you're happy to answer a few of these, we can sign off.
Of course.
So apart from aviation, do you have any other hobbies?
Yeah, well, writing is currently a hobby, but hopefully something more serious. I ski a lot, play basketball, but I do fly as a hobby as well. So I have a Yak 50 aerobatic airplane. It's a former Soviet recip 9-cylinder radial engine that I go out and fly dogfighting now that I can't actually get my dogfighting fix with a jet. I have to go out and go dogfight some friends in a recip engine.
Brilliant. So it could be a silly question to ask, but what is your favorite aircraft you've managed to fly in your career?
I would say that my favorite aircraft was the F-14, but my favorite mission was the F-5. Flying the F-5 as an adversary was absolutely my favorite mission.
Brilliant. And is there one aircraft you wish you could have flown in your career?
Oh, yeah, the F-16 as an adversary.
Oh, really?
Oh, my God. Yeah, that would have been the most amazing adversary platform ever.
Yeah, especially the old Navy ones with the big G engine. That would have been, apparently it was a rocket ship, that little thing.
Absolutely. And the ones they have now, the F-16As that the Top Gun is flying now is also, it's not quite as capable, but it's still just an incredible adversary platform.
Brilliant. Well, Paco, just want to say thank you very much for being on the show and sharing your story. I could chat with you for hours, but I think this is going to be a great interview and our viewers are going to enjoy hearing about the A-6, your new book, and Speed and Angels. So a big thank you for coming on.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.